I really like The Last of Us Part 2, as you could probably tell by its number 5 spot on my best games of 2020 list. But I'm aware of what saying that entails, even to this day. It's weird to think of one of 2020's best-selling games as controversial, but that's kinda how it all turned out. It's also why I'm making this video long after everyone has stopped caring. Is the latest Naughty Dog title perfect? Nah, it's got some messy bits and a whole lot of disappointing baggage behind the scenes, but regardless of the hype, hate, and legitimate criticism, The Last of Us Part 2 is a thoughtful and risky story buoyed by challenging and resonant gameplay. There are even clever design choices that use the mechanics to enhance the narrative, elevating what could have just been another cinematic game. It's a sequel that refused to rest on its laurels. No coasting on the original's legacy here, just a violent upending of our preconceived notions.
Give me your hand! We're gonna have to run!
The game begins by interrogating its role in popularizing dad games. Games that explore the actions, obligations, and dynamics of a father-child bond, typically with a morally complicated dad who becomes more likable through their relationship with their kid. While The Last of Us wasn't the first or last dad game, it arguably did the most to codify the trend in the AAA space. The Last of Us Part 2 looks at this patriarchal canon and asks, what are the consequences of lionizing dads who do bad things for complex reasons? What if we humanize their victims in the same way we humanized them? Joel felt sympathetic to the audience because we were only given his side of the story, a narrow lens that led many players toward a charitable interpretation of his actions. The rose-tinted glasses came all the way off when we saw the perspective of the women he hurt. Ever since Joel lied to her about the Fireflies, Elise felt a subtle, nagging distrust with her new father figure. This opening scene highlights the tension behind his overbearing paternalism. He's singing this painfully intimate song about how a 14-year-old girl is keeping his identity stable, all while the cinematography literally traps us in the frame with him. It's both sweet and overbearing, an early sign of the divide that will start growing between them. He followed this song with 4 consistent years of deception, escalating the gaslighting as Ellie poked holes in his story. To keep up the charade, he actively undermined Ellie's grasp on her own reality, shooting down her questions and dismissing the life she had before they met. So when Ellie finally forced the truth out of him, uncovering the lies disgusted her, and she ended their friendship.
So I stopped them.
It's kind of fucked up you did that.
She lost faith in her last true ally, and burning that bridge hurt her psyche pretty badly. The brash and earnest Ellie we knew from the first game was deeply wounded by this breach of trust, leaving her antagonistic, emotionally guarded, and vigilant to the risks of companionship. Walking through town demonstrates her social reticence handily. The residents of Jackson happily greet Jesse, but when Ellie approaches, they stare, blankly, before returning to their conversations. It's evident how Ellie doesn't feel like she belongs, like there's no one she can really trust. Of course, Abby's beef with Joel is a little more tangible. Her father was the Firefly doctor assigned to operate on Ellie, to use the cordyceps in her brain to manufacture a cure for the infection. He didn't survive the procedure.
I won't let you take her. This is our future. Think of all the lives we'll save.
It's kind of fucked up you did that.
For Joel to feel more like a father again, he had to take Abby's father away. That loss left her without the kind of moral guidance she needed in the post-apocalypse. Jerry Anderson was a kind man with a hopeful outlook on humanity's survival. As a doctor and a Firefly, his worldview prized healing and good works rather than isolation and fear. Robbed of that beneficent perspective, Abby was picked up by a violent, xenophobic militia. The Washington Liberation Front manipulated her confusion and taught her to channel her grief into hate. They molded her into a ruthless killer and gave her a chance at revenge.
You don't get to rush this.
It's kind of fucked up you did.
Joel's death kicks off an emotional cascade for both Ellie and Abby, a tumultuous journey through the most extreme rendition of the Naughty Dog gameplay loop. Surviving means taking the time to scrounge for supplies and loose ammo. The cabinets, closets, and containers of Seattle support your arsenal of DIY explosives, sharp objects, and helpful curatives. As players traverse the hostile landscape, they discover small stories of people who perished before them. Unlucky bank robbers, apartment fortresses, militarized disaster response teams, and missing pet flyers add character to a city under lockdown. Narratively, these diversions are vestiges of the lives people built before the collapse of society. Mechanically, these echoes from the past became treasures for Ellie and Abby, whose attention to the forgotten helped sustain them in the future. That achingly human potential is why the constant search for supplies never felt tedious. There was always a chance of finding a miraculous boost or essential ingredient. The crafting and upgrades reinforced a sense of surviving by the skin of your teeth. Pull together loose garbage so you can claw your way out of danger, as wriggling between the tight spaces hones your killer instincts. Ducking into narrow passages and crafting on the fly are the cornerstones of combat. Enemies disperse themselves strategically, spreading out just enough to shake players from cover. When they spot you, their whole squad is alerted, quickly moving to flank you at every chance. Getting caught is always a mess of bullets and blades, but creative use of the environment lets players maintain the advantage. So when the opportunity presents itself, players can thin the enemy ranks more decisively, and the results are honestly kind of hideous. Sneaking around means slicing someone's throat or choking them out with your beefy arms. The standard means of killing in video games lent an additional helping of disgust through Naughty Dog's genuinely unhealthy obsession with detail. Now, violence is pretty common in video games, but despite its B-movie mushroom zombie story, The Last of Us Part 2 eschews any attempt at schlock. It prefers the humorless rips and thuds of destroying human meat, followed by the gurgles and clicks of everything you kill. Combat is frantic and purposeful, grueling and precise. Bursts of chaos are followed by decisive strikes to restore the quiet. It creates a strong tonal fit with the confusion and frustration of the story. Before Joel was killed, Ellie resolved to let him back into her life, do things together again, and mend the rift between them. But the chance to forgive Joel was taken away from her forever. Now she feels the overwhelming guilt of pushing him away. She's left feeling psychologically ineffectual, emotionally determined to reconnect with Joel, but physically unable to offer true forgiveness. When the distance could no longer be closed by love, she turned to the one thing that kept their relationship together even at its worst: violence. Ellie's flashback made this dynamic clear. After the fondness between them breaks down, killing is their lowest common denominator. 16-year-old Ellie quietly resents Joel. She barely wants to talk about it with Tommy and feels deeply uncomfortable at the thought of spending time with him. But once the battle starts, she and Joel are a dynamic duo. The skirmish is punctuated by an excellent reversal of the bloater death animation from the previous game, when Joel swoops in to literally save their relationship with violence. When times are at their toughest, he cements their bond in blood. This is why Ellie can't stop hunting Abby, no matter how dangerous it becomes. She acts in a manner symbolic of the last time she and Joel were on speaking terms. In her mind, Joel died thinking she still resented him, that by reaching out to others, she was leaving him behind. Killing Abby seemed like the only way to prove that she cared all along. But in this impotent rage, her memory of him is fracturing, one symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder among many. Meanwhile, Dina is desperately trying to support her girlfriend, doing what she can to keep her grounded. Dina knows too well what it's like to grieve and feel hatred. There's an alternate universe where she's as much of a badass as Joel, but she processed her loss far more healthily than he or his surrogate daughter. Part of it came from her loose connection to Judaism, the rest came from her desire to bond with others, build new relationships to honor the old ones. Unfortunately, for all her love, Dina is still her own woman, not as codependent as Joel. Her life and her decisions get in the way, so she has to watch Ellie descend into the most vicious parts of herself, struggling to stay supportive. Meanwhile, Ellie is torn between dissonant desires: take back what Abby took from her, or turn those difficult emotions to the woman who might guide her through them. Sadly, the latter seems less like an option the longer Ellie remains in Seattle.
It's kind of fucked up.
Abby, on the other hand, starts to doubt the WLF now that she's taken revenge. She reflects on their vicious protocols, how they've become more like Fedra with every resistance they've crushed. Violent clashes between the militia and the religious extremists known as the Seraphites have escalated, and the bodies keep piling up. In a bid to pacify the threat for good, the WLF leader Isaac is planning an all-out invasion of the Seraphite home, exterminating them once and for all. To make matters worse, Abby's ex-partner Owen has been branded a traitor, and her other friends treat her like a psychopath for what she did to Joel. Mel's medical expertise kept her largely off the front lines, away from the truly gruesome stuff the soldiers have done to enforce their claim to the land. It's hard to stomach her role in the WLF, knowing how sadistic it's become to sustain itself. This confusion comes to a head after Abby is rescued by two renegade Seraphites, a young woman named Yara and a boy named Lev. They went against their better judgment and freed the trapped wolf. The shades of gray Abby's confronted with prompt flashbacks to the death of her father, and the aimlessness she felt since losing him. She's lost touch with his hopeful worldview and the Firefly's promise of a better future. Jerry Anderson wouldn't have recognized the daughter who killed on his behalf, but helping these desperate children felt like a step in the right direction.
Those scars?
I need whatever medical supplies you have.
Consequently, her journey with Lev is transformative. He places the Seraphite world into context, demonstrating how their culture evolved alongside the wolves. Their actions are a consequence of resisting an aggressive, heavily armed militia. Even though the Seraphites have rejected him for his gender transition, Lev still lives by the human ideals behind his upbringing.
Just think about the good parts too.
The good parts.
Yeah, like you run faster. You're more focused. You don't feel pain as much. Every bad feeling, your palms sweating, your heart racing, they're all signs you're actually stronger. So when you feel afraid, you should think about how your body is getting ready for what's coming. Only when weak may I carry my true strength.
This relationship gives Abby some vital perspective on the WLF and how they've warped her sense of right and wrong. Their ability to play-act civilization is dependent on the violence they trained into her. But now, Abby is better able to see the harm she's caused. Being there for Lev, in spite of where he came from, was in line with the life Jerry Anderson would have wanted for her. And by carrying out his kindness, his soul stopped feeling so far away. Put a pin in that. It will be relevant later. In spite of Abby's revelation, the war between the WLF and the Seraphites already began. She flees from the burning wreckage of the opposing societies, tearing through the WLF leadership as she goes. As her whole world goes up in smoke, she barely escapes with her life from the Seraphite Island. Then Ellie catches up to her. The vengeful path that led Abby to Joel now leads Ellie back to her, and Ellie's death march through Seattle has filed her down into a killing machine. It's fitting that Ellie is controlled by an AI when she's her most alienated from the girl she used to be. Now the stage is literally set for the reformed killer and the woman she wronged to face off. The fight pulls off an impressive act of emotional transference via a daring perspective shift. As a player, I'm stuck with conflicting feelings. I don't want to kill Ellie. I feel her pain as she tried to make sense of a life after Joel, and I'm angry about his death on her behalf. At the same time, I followed Abby as she freed herself from the suicidal machinations of the WLF, learning to love again. Plus, from her perspective, Ellie is a terrifying killer who will bury me in lead if I let my guard down. Abby feels this conflict too, which is why she ended up sparing Ellie, in spite of her rage. She watched the WLF force itself into an unwinnable battle through hatred and ignorance. Her worldview is more flexible now, and the righteousness of bloodshed is muddled by rediscovered humanity. When players feel nauseous fighting Ellie, it mirrors Abby's realization that killing Joel led her to this moment. Her friends are dead, her cause is lost, and the only thing revenge got her was a target on her back. By ending the fight and walking away, we're acting out Abby's embrace of the core theme, that revenge solves nothing. It just leaves you sick and empty-handed. Of course, getting to moments like these involve some narrative clumsiness. Firstly, Naughty Dog is in love with flashbacks. It began in Uncharted 2 and hasn't stopped since. Don't misunderstand me. Flashbacks have their place, and other stories have used them to great effect. But The Last of Us Part 2 depends so deeply on flashbacks that it overcomplicates its story just to fit them all in. Abby's side wasn't really hurt by this, since she's new. I was more curious about what her deal was, and seeing her relationships play out provided some insight into her growth as a person. Instead, I found Ellie's story lacking. All her flashbacks were to update the audience on her fallout with Joel, and they didn't sufficiently inform her trek through Seattle, physically or emotionally. Sure, in the big picture, the flashbacks explain how Ellie's guilt manifested in a self-annihilating revenge scheme, but in the moment-to-moment gameplay of her second and third day in Seattle, those dreams of Joel don't have a place in her waking life. She doesn't share her feelings with Jesse, the Seraphites don't substantively complicate her plans, and tracking down Tommy's rampage doesn't meaningfully influence her or Dina's feelings about Joel. Speaking of whom, I think Ellie's story is best when she's interacting with Dina, but after the pregnancy reveal, Dina's role is drastically pulled back, leaving Ellie's second and third days quite hollow. If the narrative insists on lengthening Ellie's story to parallel Abby's, then Ellie should get more emotional development with the woman she loves. Some interaction might have put her downward spiral into context, more so than just periodically reading her journal entries. Which leads me to a criticism I never thought I'd level at a Naughty Dog game. The dialogue was really sparse, especially at the story peaks. Nobody let out their emotions or explained themselves. It was all just anger, swearing, and impatience. I understand that circumstances have bludgeoned everyone's emotional reasoning skills into an unrecognizable mess, but from start to finish, I was surprised at how little was actually said between Ellie and Joel, Ellie and Dina, Ellie and Abby, etc. I know that grand speeches about big feelings are a little too corny, a little too anime, and counter to the tone this game was trying to set. We're meant to make inferences and explore their motivations with empathy and emotional intelligence, but the dearth of articulate dialogue probably explains why so many gamers couldn't engage with the story, especially with Abby. Regarding Abby's role in the franchise, I think Naughty Dog was trying to have their cake and stab it too. What I mean is that making a sequel involved a tightrope walk of expectation management. The team had to strike a balance between giving fans what they want and crafting a story that adds to the conversation started by its predecessor. Indulge the fans too much, and you sacrifice the art for the market. Challenge the fans too much, and you sacrifice the market for the art. This intersecting 3-day structure felt like a concession to those conflicting expectations, telling the deconstructionist story they intended while throwing bones to the fans who only cared about Ellie and Joel.
Close your eyes. It'll be worth it.
It felt like too much attention was paid to a character who wouldn't actually grow until much later in the game, just so they can tell a full story for the woman they had more to say about. I'm not claiming that I'm a better writer than Hallie Gross, nor am I fixing her script. That's a stupendously arrogant thing to say about the woman who wrote for Westworld. Still, focus your story on the woman you have more to say about is usually considered good writing advice.
It's kind of fucked up you did that.
Ellie's story is about becoming a machine and pursuing her single-minded ambition, alone. Any part that didn't involve Joel, Dina, Jesse, or anyone else just felt lacking. That being said, given how The Last of Us Part 2 sets up its characters, its story structure, and its abundance of flashbacks, I think this chaotic swirl of a narrative still had a fantastic ending. Yeah, I know what I'm saying when I say this. This ending was the most controversial part of an already polarizing game, and I thought it was great. Let me explain why. Remember that pin I left in Abby's story? Well, her big character transformation involved closing the gap between her and her father's memory. 4 years of killing for the WLF so she could finally get a chance to kill Joel has only separated Abby from the people she loves. Instead, it's an act of radical kindness that eases her grief, earns her a new friend, and honors her father's legacy. But Ellie still feels bound to vengeance, still stews in her indebtedness to Joel's memory, her grief complicated by a violent past and the weight of regret. Flashbacks to the night of his death keep intruding on her new life, triggers forcing her to relive the moment and never let it pass. Despite her life with Dina, despite her child, and despite Abby's mercy, she still feels like she let Joel down when he was always there for her. So when a broken and defeated Tommy pressured her into tracking Abby one last time, the guilt boiled to the surface, and she left for Santa Barbara.
Stay. I can't.
This last chapter of the game is dire. The Rattlers are the most depraved group we've seen so far, seeming to delight in the torture they can inflict on others. Meanwhile, Ellie continues to lose herself to her sense of failure and obligation, honoring Joel in the only way that seems possible, more singular and resolute than ever. But then she finds Abby and Lev, strung up on the beach, emaciated after months of torture, barely able to speak. For a moment, Ellie hesitates. The woman she cut down from her crucifix wasn't the woman who beat Joel to death, who shot Tommy and
It's kinda
Jesse,
fucked up you
and
did
who
that.
almost killed Dina. This gaunt, aching creature looks back at her, scared and defeated, using the last of her strength to save her friend. For a moment, Ellie's compassion took over, extending a hand to someone who suffered far worse than she could imagine. For a moment, revenge seemed so empty, so meaningless. And then, the moment passed. The final confrontation between Ellie and Abby isn't even a fight. It's a miserable exhibition of a woman at her lowest, and I wanted it to stop. Abby, dragged back into a conflict she thought she was over with, wanted this to stop. I've played this game 3 times through, and each time I wish that Ellie would just get on the boat and steer home, leave her misery behind, go back to the life she had. But she can't. She tried so hard to move on, spent a year and change trying to find peace, but Joel still haunts her. The life they had, the forgiveness she denied, the loneliness in his absence. Now here she is, at the edge of the world. She abandoned her home, her friends, her love, and her child to chase retribution, the only thing she has left. Killing Abby had to set things right with Joel, had to make up for the years of distrust and separation, had to prove that she valued his life when it was there. This death had to count, otherwise... Right as Ellie was about to cross the threshold, about to finally destroy the object of her animosity, she recalls a single glimpse of Joel, sitting on his porch, smiling and looking pleased to see her. It's a brief yet disarming moment of joy, unhampered by intrusive thoughts of torture and mutilation. Brought to tears by the quiet power of a happy memory, Ellie lifts Abby's head from the water and begs her to go, sitting by herself to face the bleak future that could have been. It's unclear exactly what inspired Ellie to give up her quest. To this day, some fans and critics still hate that Abby just got away with killing Joel, that Ellie could let go of the anger when so many of them couldn't. While the ambiguous ending leaves much to the player's interpretation, I think there's a lot to unpack in the final exchange between Joel and Ellie. After killing the Fireflies, Joel tried to hide the truth, acting out of selfish desperation because he didn't want to be alone again, to be the man he was in Boston again. Having spent a year apart from Ellie, he doesn't regret what he did, but his outlook has changed. Saving her stopped being about saving Sarah by proxy. For anything good to come from his actions, he had to accept that Ellie was going to chart her own path, one that may not include him. She deserved to be angry and he had to take his lumps, but at least she'd have a chance that the Fireflies couldn't give her. She'd have a life she can share on her terms. She'd make new friends and find family in the arms of others, passing on the light that found him all those years ago. Even if Joel can only watch from the sidelines, he could at least find peace knowing that her life meant more than making up for his loss. I think this was the realization that pulled Ellie back from the precipice of self-annihilation, that living would honor Joel's death more so than another heinous act. For a game that deals so heavily in anguish and grief, this final moment is so hopeful, that even though painful emotions swarm and ensnare us, trap us in the dark corners of our mind, love and forgiveness are worth the effort they take to summon. The arduous task of self-reflection and growth will always be more rewarding than reaction, resentment, and hate. In a way, it's not so bad that she can't play Joel's song anymore, because now she doesn't need to. If she ever were to lose him, then she'd keep him in her memory, as she lived each day for herself. Of course, that is the hopeful sentiment I would have liked to end on, but the reality of AAA game development still needs to cut through the effusive praise. The Last of Us Part 2 was made through harmful crunch development. Crunch is sadly common in the game industry. Rockstar, BioWare, Epic, CD Projekt Red, Telltale Games, and many others report extended development hours, burnout, health problems, and worker attrition. According to Jason Schreier's article in Kotaku, Naughty Dog is allegedly one of the worst offenders. The 12-hour days, weekend shifts, minimally responsive management, and creative changes strain the team, but worker attrition compounds the issue. As exhausted developers leave, veteran staff are stretched thin, unable to closely monitor new hires. Junior staff are left grasping for direction, not yet experienced enough to work with the speed and skill of their seniors. So when burnout or dissatisfaction create another wave of departures, the whole cycle of crunch begins again. I struggle to point the finger at one person or policy because crunch culture is a culture. Sure, publishers and shareholders can set unfair deadlines, but Naughty Dog still decides who to hire, how the company is structured, and which creative decisions require massive schedule changes. They foster a culture of passion that praises employees who overwork themselves and makes pariahs out of those who enforce a work-life balance. As Naughty Dog continues to bleed talented people from the industry, maybe their next big innovation could be to curtail the harm they've caused their workers. The sustainability of the industry is at stake. I assume the people still there want to make games for as long as they can, so why risk killing the thing you love by working yourself and others to the bone? As Ellie and Abby taught me, there's no pride in enduring misery like this. It just leads to more pain.